So before I start, let me just quickly kind of do some market research here. How many of you are doing Agile in your companies? Okay. How many of you are doing Scrum? Okay. Why are you here? Okay. So, well, this is a Scrum primer, so I'm going to talk about what Scrum is, the principles, the roles, the practices. There's actually quite a lot of content, so I'm not sure how we are going to do with time, but let's hope for the best. Scrum is probably one of the most popular Agile frameworks, and the reason for that is that it comes as a package. It comes as a set of rules that in order to implement Scrum, in order to implement Agile, you just need to follow. Of course, this is a bit deceiving. In fact, Scrum, practicing Scrum is quite difficult, but again, it comes as a package, and in that sense is a bit easier to manage at the beginning than Kanban that Mateusz and Tomek are going to talk about later. And my clicker is not working. Well, I better switch it on then. Okay. Before we move to Scrum, I would like to introduce you to two people. First, this is my daughter, Annika. She's about 11 months old. If any one of you could just take a picture of her on the big cinema screen, that would be great. I would have a nice memory. So Annika is 11 months old, and it's amazing how much she's been able to learn during the last 11 months. She came to this world as an essentially human-looking potato, and within 11 months she's able to eat, crawl, talk, smile, interact a lot. All this not because she had some big plan about what she's going to do with this 11 months, but just because she experimented a lot, she interacted with the environment, she interacted with me, my wife. So that's Annika. Okay, so the second person is Bjarte Boxnes. Bjarte is vice president of something at Statoil. This is a big gas and oil company, a Norwegian company, Fortune 500 company. And so what's interesting about Statoil is that a couple of years ago they implement something that's called beyond budgeting. And what that means is that instead of having a yearly budget process, which a lot of companies currently have, so you plan ahead 12 months, 2 years in advance of how you're going to spend your money, instead of doing that, Statoil is, basically saying, we're going to spend your money whenever we have a good cause, good reason to spend the money. We are not going to plan ahead too much because, we don't know how the reality will look like 6 months or 12 months from now. Statoil is not the only company that does that. There are quite a few others. If you're interested, I really encourage you to look it up. It's called beyond budgeting. So what these two approaches have in common is that they both show that you don't need a long-term plan. You don't always need a long-term plan to succeed. In fact, in a modern world, which is constantly changing, sticking to your original plan might in fact be harmful. If there is a new competitor in the market, a new product in the market, if your ecosystem changes, you need to adapt to reflect those changes, otherwise you will just fail. And this is the basic realization that Scrum has, that instead of planning ahead, instead of having a detailed plan of what we are going to do 12 months, 16 months from now, remember the waterfall model when you start with analysis and then when you actually come to a stage when you're building stuff or shipping stuff, it's like 10 months later. So instead of doing that, you want to have a framework that allows you to constantly interact with your environment and constantly learn about your environment in order to adapt to possible changes. So not long-term plan, but rather an ongoing feedback loop of you and your product interacting with the environment. Scrum is an iterative, experimental, and incremental framework. Iterative because it develops products in short cycles. Typically those can be between 1 to 4 weeks. Probably the 2 weeks is an average. It's incremental because after each cycle, after each iteration, you want to have a new value in your product. Because, and that's the third feature of Scrum, you want to experiment with those values. You want to ship new features, you want to ship new things, because this is the only way you can learn, and then based on this learning, you can then further develop your product. So again, iterative, incremental, and experimental. The name itself comes from rugby. Scrum is actually a position in rugby where 5, 8, couple of guys are pushing together. You can see it here. Okay, so what are the roles? There are 3 roles in Scrum. The most important, well, I shouldn't have said most important role is product owner. A product owner is a person who has the vision about the product. The product owner knows what we want to do in order to satisfy our customers, satisfy our users, our clients. The product owner has a vision and is able to tell the team, the rest of the team, what makes sense to be built. It's a one person, and this is the ultimate decision maker when it comes to what gets done and what doesn't get done. It's not a simple role. It's not an easy role. Probably this is one of the common pitfalls of when you're implementing Scrum, that people just say, well, here, John or Kate there, let's just put this person on product owner role. We know that she has a million other responsibilities, but she will be a good product owner. Product owner is a full-time job. Product owner is something, if you want to be a good product owner, you really need to dedicate your time for it. The second role out of 3 roles is the team, the development team. These are the guys who are doing the stuff that needs to be done. Product owner tells us what needs to be done. The team knows how this things needs to be done and delivers it. Typically, or in fact, well, not typically, but this is one of the rules of the Scrum, because this is a cross-functional team. So you don't want to have different people doing different things. You don't want to have, DBA specialists versus analysts versus testers. You want to have a team that's able to learn from each other, that is able to do any of the tasks that needs to be done, despite who is doing what. It's autonomous in terms of no one outside of the team is telling the team what to do. It's self-organizing, and that means that they know how to improve their process, or at least they try to improve their process. And typically this is 7 ± 2 people. So again, cross-functional, self-organizing, and autonomous. The third role is Scrum Master. It's interesting, I have a picture of Yoda here, and Angel, I don't know how many of you have been at his presentation, also represented Scrum Master at some level, at least as a Yoda. So Scrum Master is a bit different to the other 2 roles, because Scrum Masters are not focused on delivering value in terms of product. Product owner works with the product, the team makes the product. Scrum Masters work on a process. They help the team to follow the process. It's especially important at the beginning when the teams are not that mature. You have to be able to tell the team what's good, what's bad in terms of the Scrum framework. Once the team matures, this is probably not that important any longer, but still there will be a lot of obstacles coming at the team, and you have to have someone protecting and removing those obstacles, removing those impediments, and this is the role of a Scrum Master. So maybe there is some manager who really want to get this guy to do some other stuff, or maybe we need a new machine, or maybe there is some problem with our integration server. All these kind of things that are not necessarily related to our product but our process. This is the Scrum Master responsibility. And notice this is actually a very This was a very smart thing to do when this framework was originally created. The team who devised those rules at the very beginning, at the very kind of origin of the framework, decided that we have to have at least one person, we have to have one person who will act as a gatekeeper or as a protector of the framework itself, telling people what's allowed, what's not allowed within the framework. This is really annoying. Okay. Despite the name, Scrum is not actually a master. It's rather a servant. It helps people. He coaches people. He's rather a servant of the other roles than a manager of them. Artifacts. There are two main artifacts in Scrum. First is product backlog. Product backlog is a list of things that needs to be done. There can be different level of detail in those list of items. I mean, you can a valid product backlog item would be implement Bitcoin support in our online store. But that, of course, at some point needs to be translated into some more detailed items, such as, for example, being able to add a Bitcoin address. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not that much of a Bitcoin expert, but what I'm trying to say is that different levels of abstractions in the backlog are okay. It doesn't need to be fixed, it doesn't need to be perfect, because backlog is evolving as we are working on the product. So the things that are at the top of the backlog, which are those that are coming next into our development, because these are the items with the highest priority, those will be quite specified, those will be very detailed, and those will be items that then the team can basically take and work on. Those which are a bit lower in the backlog will be probably more abstract, maybe more general. Again, it changes. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a fixed plan. We learn as we build. We discover new things. Maybe this new thing that we just launched triggered some new ideas, and we see that there is some potential that we want to experiment. Well, we just need to add it to our backlog, and this will get done at some point. The person who is managing the backlog ultimately is the product owner. So, you know, whatever comes next, whatever is most important in terms of the value, it's the product owner decision. Okay, next artifact. Remember that Scrum is a iterative process. So you have a cycle of work where you deliver an increment of your product. And this cycle of work is represented as sprint backlog. I think the quality is a bit shite here, but what you have here is essentially the top of the backlog that's cut at some point. Let's say the team gathers and say, well, okay, so what we are going to do in next 2 weeks? Well, we can do this thing, and probably this thing, and that's about it. So those 3 items will then be represented and will be then turned into the sprint backlog. Sprint backlog is the things that we want to deliver within the next iteration. Again, the iteration is very short, so this is not typically a very, very long plan. How does the team know what's enough? Well, they have some experience. They've worked on this backlog in the past, so they know, how much work they can typically do during their iteration. Let's say 2-week iteration. The backlog items are also estimated. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but basically there is a number representing the effort that's needed. Yeah. So let's say this has a 5, this has a 3, this has a 2, and altogether they represent 10 points of effort, and the team knows that it's the 10 points that they can deliver within a 2-weekly or a weekly cycle, depending on what's their iteration length. So only two artifacts. Different teams manage it different way. You have a lot of teams doing actual physical boards, like you see here, where basically during the iteration every day people can come and update the progress of what's currently in progress, what's currently tested and done. Of course, those column labels are somewhat arbitrary. I mean, you can have those, you can have others, maybe simpler, just to do in progress and done. But this is an example of physical board. You can also have an a digital version of your Scrum board, or of the backlog, of the product backlog itself. We use Jira, for example, in our company. I think it's quite a popular tool for that, for both product backlog and the sprint backlog. Okay, so meetings. Many people say that there are a lot of meetings in Scrum or in Agile because you have to communicate a lot. And it might be true, but it's not necessarily that big of a, it's not a big problem. And you'll see it in a second when I'm going to show you a calendar of a typical meeting schedule. So there are 5 meetings in Scrum framework. The sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, retrospective. These come one after another. The sprint planning is essentially a meeting where you decide what's going to be done within a sprint. This is, remember, the sprint backlog. This is where you create the backlog and plan for the next iteration for the next 2 weeks. Once, and that's also important, once the sprint backlog is established, there is no way you can renegotiate the scope of what's going to be delivered within the next iteration. So, yes, Scrum is adaptive. Yes, Scrum encourages change and, you know, allows us to work in a risky environment when we find out new things as we go. But also the key assumption is that once we set our next iteration of development, that's set. That's a contract that we don't want to change. And that's good because you don't want to have all kinds of different distractions coming at you while you're doing your work. So this commitment is done on the sprint planning meeting. Now, once the sprint planning meeting is completed, every day the team meets during the iteration during the daily Scrum meetings. Then at the end there is sprint review, retrospective. I'm going to come back to those a bit later, so I don't want to go into detail. And then there is also a fifth meeting, which is called backlog refinement / backlog grooming, where the team meets to discuss the backlog together with the product owner. That doesn't necessarily this meeting is just there. Typically, it's around 10% of your time, but it's not like a fixed date. So this is a typical, let's say, a calendar of a team that works in Scrum in a weekly cycle. You have sprint planning here on Monday morning. This is where the team commits to what's going to be done within the week. This is also where the developers themselves decide how they are going to do the product backlog items, because it's not only the commitment to the product owner that yes, we are going to implement registering a Bitcoin wallet, yes, we are going to add, I don't know, a password reminder to our website, but there is also a question how we are going to do it, and this is where the developers sit together and decide what does it mean in practice to implement Bitcoin payments, what tasks needs to be delivered in order to do it. So this is here, and once we are done to start our work. The sprint backlog appears on a board or in your on your digital website that when you're storing your sprint backlogs, and you continue with your work. Every day you meet for daily Scrum. There is a sprint review and retrospective at the end, and there is also a backlog refinement meeting here somewhere. It doesn't need to be here, it could be and pretty much anywhere else. What's important, this is the beginning of the sprint, because of course you have to have the plan, the short-term plan at the beginning, and this comes at the end, which is the review and retrospective. And I'm not sure whether I mentioned, I'm using cycle, iteration, and sprint, the three words interchangeably, because they essentially mean the same thing. The sprint is the cycle of work that you're doing. Okay, so the daily Scrum, this is a meeting, a so-called stand-up meeting where the team comes together and everyone asks or answers 3 questions. What have I done since the last meeting? What have I done? What did I do yesterday in order to achieve what we committed to achieve during this sprint? What am I planning to do today? And what are the obstacles that are preventing me from working at my, let's say, full speed or fully efficiently? With those are the 3 questions. There is no long discussions, or there is really not too much of it's not too much of a conversation. It's rather everyone is just saying their own progress. It's important because we want to keep this meeting short. We want to make this meeting as part of a kind of a natural daily cycle without becoming too difficult or too much of a hassle. So we just come, we stand, usually up until 10-15 minutes we are done. If there are problems, if there are obstacles, if there is something which is not clear and is not allowing me to continue or finish what I planned to do, then we have a follow-up meeting at maybe later or at some other time of the day. Usually the sprint backlog is updated during this stand-up meeting, and usually, in fact, if you have a physical board, the meeting would be held close to the physical board itself. Okay, so just coming back, you have the planning, the daily scrums, at the end you have a review. Review is 1 hour session where you come together with your stakeholders, possibly some other people than just your product owner who would like to give you input about what have you achieved during the last week or 2 weeks, and you review together what has been achieved, what worked, what didn't work in terms of your product. Maybe they will want to tell you that, hey, actually you implemented this menu on the left side, but in fact we would like to have it on the top. Well, no problem, we can come back to this and fix it in the next sprint. This is the opportunity to talk about your product among yourselves, with your product owner, and possibly with other stakeholders. Notice that this is not only demo. Some people just say, well, yeah, at the end you have demo. It's not enough, well, at least the theory says that it's not enough to just have a 10-minute or 20-minute demo of your product after each cycle. You really want to engage with people who can contribute, who can give you feedback, because it's important. It's important. This is the only way you can learn and make sure that the next sprint you will also deliver something that's valuable for them. So the review is the sprint review is a meeting where when you gather to discuss how have you performed in terms of your product, or how have you performed in terms of achieving your sprint goal, in terms of the sprint backlog. But you also have another meeting, and you see it here. That's after the sprint review, where you discuss your process. And notice again, in a weekly schedule, you have 1 hour of review and 1 hour of retrospective. Retrospective is a meeting where you discuss what can be done better not in terms of your product, but in terms of your process. Maybe you have some hard time doing your tests, or maybe the fact that some guy who is new worked independently on something, actually then delayed the whole thing because then someone else had to I don't know, coach him or discuss, maybe fix what was done. All these kind of things that are not really related to your product but how you work are the topics of the conversation about and during the retrospective meetings. The retrospective meeting is facilitated by the Scrum Master. And as you saw, it lasts around an hour in a typical one-week iteration. Don't get, especially at the beginning, there is a tendency of just saying, well, after a few, let's say, weeks or months, everything kind of works. Why do we want to have the retrospective meeting? Everything just works, and we don't really see how we could improve any further. Retrospective, I have a cool quote from when I was researching on Toyota. Toyota is a very famous company for their lean perspective, and also how they implement this continuous improvement strategy on the company level. And this continuous improvement effort in Toyota is compared to squeezing a dry towel. Yeah, so imagine that it's not, when you're doing this retrospective meeting, it's not only about just doing what's obvious and spotting the things that are you know, really painful. Those probably can be managed fairly easily at the beginning, and then once you mature, refrain from this tendency of just saying, hey, we are okay, then we don't need to improve. Think about this dry towel that you need to squeeze in order to really, really improve. Just a few tips for those of you who are thinking about how to start. I would say 3 things. Realize that it's not easy. Implementing this in your organization won't be an easy thing, despite that it kind of looks as a rigid package that's just so obvious and easy to follow. It's actually a cultural change that many people can oppose and will oppose. So prepare for problems, and I'm speaking from my own experience. I would have probably done it better if I was prepared for problems rather than success. In order to prepare for problems, get help. There are a lot of good coaches around. You could just address. I'm not one of them, so I'm not selling my services here. I see some sitting in this room, so I'm selling them now. And finally, especially at the beginning, don't change the rules of the Scrum framework itself. The rules, of course, can be manipulated at a certain level of your maturity, but playing with them and just saying, well, we kind of have Scrum, but we don't do retrospective. Or we kind of have Scrum, but we only do stand-ups when we feel like we need to. This approach is guaranteed to fail, and I mean, you will have some sort of a process, but that won't be Scrum. And it's important to realize that this is not just a set of prescriptions that you can take and take some and skip the others. They really, those rules facilitate each other. They have common assumptions or values that if you implement them together properly, with help of maybe external coach or a good Scrum Master, they will really kind of play together nicely. So that's important. Don't mess with the rules, especially at the beginning. And since I'm out of time, I'm just going to say that if you want to tweet or find me, you have my email and tweet account here. Thank you.